Hello again. Today we're going to continue the discussion of payoffs that we began in the last session. I want to begin with talking about externalities. Externalities are costs and benefits which are borne by third parties. These are people or organizations who are actually not involved in the deal but are impacted by the deal. We can divide these externalities into two major categories. Direct externalities, by that I mean externalities that we can sort of calculate the impact of them on the deal and thus work them into the payoff, and indirect ones which are much harder to calculate. Now, let's look at some of the positive direct externalities. Let's take an example. I talked earlier about the Prius, a car made by Toyota. It's a hybrid. Or you could take the Chevy Volt, or I think Chevy has a Silverado hybrid truck. Hybrids are interesting vehicles because they generate a lot of goodwill for people, goodwill on the part of the company with people who are interested in solving the problem of global warming. They reduce the carbon footprint. And they also reduce the need for importing oil from other countries. So there are lots of positive spin-off associated with hybrids. The goodwill builds brand loyalty. Over time, goodwill means you can pay a premium, garner a premium for a product you're selling, and thus we can calculate the impact of goodwill in terms of the added price that you can charge and work it into the payoff on a deal. I'm going to license a better hybrid engine or a paddle for inductive coupling for an electric car. That creates goodwill for the company who in-licenses it, and that is part of that incremental profit that they're making, and I can grab a piece of that. Not always are these impacts that are positive in goodwill. There's other examples. For example, the cat just climbed in there. For example, there's another externality. The cat says, well, these lights you've got on are generating heat. Feels pretty good. Take government emissions trading. The government institutes emissions trading, pollution emissions trading, so that people, or companies rather, who overperform at reducing their pollution, that is, they exceed the regulatory minimums, garner benefits that encourage them to continue to exceed it because they can make revenue from trading their emission credit to polluters who are need to cover themselves so they don't pay fines. So by establishing a market in emissions trading, you have a direct impact on the payoffs, even though this involves externalities for parties who are not involved in the original deal. In other words, I bring a technology in, it has a certain payoff because it improves a process to some extent. It cheapens the cost of manufacturing, but if it's also cleaner, there may be the added benefit of the emissions trading. Now, on the negative side, we can also see the same kind of phenomena. When I was younger, I was involved in grape boycotts and other kind of boycotts for farm workers. We see sometimes boycotts of genetically engineered food, irradiated food. There's all sorts of economic activities that people take against manufacturers that may be politically inspired. They're doing business in Darfur or God knows what. And those are negative impacts, the boycotts, which reduces the sales. But you can probably calculate that impact if you're aware that there's a group out there and you're going to suffer a boycott from doing certain kinds of things like in licensing a genetically engineered product. Another example in the government area where we can calculate it pretty clearly is regulations. If you violate Food and Drug Administration or environmental protection or other kinds of regulations, you know you're going to pay a fine if they catch you, and that fine and the probability of that fine can be calculated. So where do we end up on direct externalities? Well, basically, if they're positive, they're direct because it's easy to translate the externality, the utility aspect of the externality, into revenue to the company, either through added sales through goodwill or through emissions trading or some other vehicle. And if it's negative, we can look at the transformation of a negative utility into cost similarly. one of the things that highlights for us is that we need to be aware when we're doing deals of where stakeholders are at. That's other groups who are affected by it, may have a stake in what occurs. And thus we need to look at market forces and what stakeholders are likely to do, because the actions of stakeholders are a market force. There's also indirect externalities. That is, I license something to you, it becomes public, the competition reads about it, they engage in a series of activities which may or may not have an economic impact upon the payoff that I thought was going to happen from the deal, because their activity, there's a burst of creativity on their part, they do some innovation to counter the innovation that I licensed, and all of a sudden the market share I thought I was going to get through my, or my licensee was going to get, doesn't materialize, and my revenues are lower. So we can see that there is this kind of chain of cause and effect that can occur in indirect externalities that can have an effect, but they may not have effect. Another area you see this is in the area of IP leakage. We know that it's easier to get a payoff in a deal if I can protect the IP, but if I patent the IP, if I'm protecting it that way, I may encourage others to design around it, and that's an indirect externality. I'm not sure it will affect the cost, but it may affect the cost. It's hard to calculate. Really, these are sort of murky categories, direct and indirect. It really depends on how easy it is to calculate the direct impact upon the payoff. But it does highlight an important point, and the important point it highlights is that there are both monetary and non-monetary payoffs, and we'll look at that in the next session. That's the first point it highlights. And the second point it highlights is that in deals, and when we look at deals and the whole area of moving a technology to market, there's a lot of feedback loops in these. And so this is a nonlinear problem, meaning there's many feedback loops, they run all over the place. And it's a non-monotonic problem, meaning the next piece of data may change the conclusions. If I find out that I'm going to in-license a technology, and if I find out there's a bunch of stakeholders that are going to go out and boycott my company and do all sorts of things, I may back off from licensing it. So we have a nonlinear, non-monotonic situation. Well, when we come back, we'll talk about non-monetary impacts on payoffs.